All right. Hi, everybody. Should we wait another minute, maybe? Seems like people are. Yeah? Okay. We'll wait one more minute and then we'll start. Maybe we should just start now. Start? Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming to our tutorial. I'm going to let us introduce ourselves, and then we'll get started. So my name is Emily Black. I'm a postdoc at Stanford University right now. I'm starting my faculty position at Barnard in the fall. My background is in computer science, particularly algorithmic fairness. I do a lot of work on instability and fairness overlap, and also investigating deployed systems used in the government. And then here are my co-presenters.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sofia Bosch Gomez. I'm a postdoc at the Burns Center for Social Change at Northeastern University, and I'm an incoming assistant professor at the Art and Design Department. And my background is in participatory methods, public sector design, and service design.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Luisa Godinez Puch. I'm an equity scholar at Urban Institute, a think tank located in Washington, D.C. I did my PhD in political science, and I specialize in urban politics and policy and race and ethnicity. And hopefully today we can work across silos from our various disciplines to introduce this tutorial.
Okay, so to give you a bit of an overview of what we're going to do today, just so that we're all prepped and have our expectations set. So to start us off, I'll give a brief overview of the ways in which human participation has entered the machine learning pipeline and machine learning systems to date, and our perception, at least from, I think, the machine learning community, of our expectation behind human involvement in AI, particularly from the perspective of reducing harms. I'll then introduce what we mean by participation in ML, sort of from the perspective of participatory methods, and discuss some of the open questions around the use of participatory techniques in ML systems. And then I'll turn it over to Sophia, who will discuss a brief overview of co-design and participatory design methods from a design perspective, and also give an overview of a case study of using participatory methods in the development of a taxi app in Mexico City in 2019. In the third section, which will be led by Luisa, we'll talk about how to use participatory methods to drive equity. Participatory methods and equitable processes are not inherently synonymous, and we will talk about how to implement both in the projects that she discusses. Then we'll draw on one specific tool for assessing conclusions and results with stakeholders. Finally, we'll discuss how local governments have used participatory methodologies in policy and what the potentials and limitations of these projects have been. And I'd also just like to note generally, our goal in this tutorial is for you to have new questions regarding where participatory design methods can be incorporated into ML systems that you're familiar with, to which degree we can make equitable outcomes in machine learning systems with participatory methods, and when these methods are more kind of token use of them, and when they actually do lead to change in the system. So we're not necessarily offering any answers, but we just all want to discuss these things together. You know, since we love participation so much, we're hoping we can all participate together and kind of thinking about and answering those questions. And of course, also, I think this is an opportunity to take advantage of the expertise of Sophia and Luisa, who are trained with and use these techniques directly in their work. All right. So there have been many calls, including some of my own, to include those impacted by algorithmic decision systems in the creation of algorithmic decision systems in order to increase the equity of such systems. And these calls often seem to have the expectation that participation in and of itself can solve some problems of equity and harm reduction in algorithmic systems, such as misaligned goals between algorithmic systems and the communities they serve. For example, this call was in reaction to some use of predictive policing systems in Pittsburgh. So creating predictive policing systems to increase community safety may be misaligned. For example, some papers have pointed to human participation in model creation as a method to address risks of faulty problem formulation. This is another paper that was reacting to the Obermeyer paper about selecting healthcare costs as a proxy for healthcare need when creating an algorithm to distribute healthcare across populations. And they suggest here that by using a participatory approach, we can find these problems early on in the process and essentially prevent them from happening. And this expectation of human oversight or participation fixing problems of bias in machine learning systems has even trickled into law. The EU AI Act states that human oversight, among other things, is necessary to mitigate the risks of AI and provides requirements for human oversight in public-facing systems. But what are individuals actually calling for when they call for human participation in the creation and deployment of ML systems? And what constitutes participation of relevant stakeholders in these systems? And how can this at all, and how would this participation lead to decreased algorithmic harms? So I think the first question that I want to sort of think about is what constitutes participation in ML systems, and I think it might be instructive to think about different forms of human engagement with ML systems by considering the machine learning pipeline, which I have outlined here, and I'll go through it really quick. So the machine learning pipeline, in other words, is the steps that model practitioners take in order to make a machine learning model. So just as a quick refresher for anyone who isn't used to thinking about model building this way, I like to break down the machine learning model creation process into the following steps. First is viability assessments. So this is assessing the viability or functionality of AI, so the process of deciding whether or not an AI system is the right fit for a given problem, and if the relevant institution has enough capacity to house an AI system. The second is problem formulation. So once you've ostensibly decided that an AI system is the right thing to use, you decide what the model will predict and what it will use as features in order to approximate the business or policy need. So an example of this would be selecting to predict the probability of default within 3 months of getting a loan, to predict creditworthiness, whatever that means, right? So it's not saying that's the right choice, that's just one example. And then there's data collection, which I'm sure we've all thought about before is just the process of collecting data. Data pre-processing, this includes decisions on how to deal with missing data, so whether or not you impute variables, just drop them, how you maybe link different data sets, stuff like that. And then statistical modeling, which is deciding things like what actual model type am I going to use? Linear model, deep model, am I going to use what loss function am I going to use, etc. Testing and validation, which decides on an evaluation metric to choose between models, since when you're building models you always kind of have a million to choose among, and you're choosing the one with the best accuracy or the best fairness and accuracy decided by some bunch of metrics. And then finally, organizational integration, or how a model is integrated into a larger organizational decision process, which often includes interfacing with people, such as an assessment from a risk assessment instrument being handed off to a judge, or how a score from a resume screening algorithm would be handed off to a recruiter in a hiring system. So we're going to maybe use this as a backdrop to think about the different ways in which humans participate in ML systems already. But I'm just also going to note that, of course, the steps that I just outlined are just the creation of the machine learning model itself and are not the full pipeline. There are more steps, such as influence and biases from the researchers, designers, and developers who make these models, and also their impact on the communities that are affected by their decisions. And the relationships between these different groups on the model are cyclic and can and should trigger several runs through this model creation process. So I'm going to use the former pipeline, but we should, of course, all keep in mind that that's not the whole story. So we can use this pipeline as a backdrop to see the ways that humans participate in the creation of machine learning systems in a variety of ways at a variety of stages. So in a sense, the most common ways that people participate in creating machine learning system is through creating or being a part of training data sets. So Sloan et al. In Participation is Not a Design Fix for Machine Learning take the view that even having one's data included in the training set of even having one's data included in the training set of a model is an act of participation, whether that's just literally having your picture in a facial recognition data set, or if that you were an MTurker that helped label some of the data. And while we'd like to acknowledge the wealth of perspectives and debates on what constitutes participation, after sort of discussing with my colleagues, they informed me that they focus on sort of active participation when we think about participation in ML systems in terms of participatory techniques. Another very common form of engagement or human oversight of AI systems is human-in-the-loop or algorithm-in-the-loop decision-making, when an algorithmic system provides a recommendation or other piece of information to a human who ultimately makes a decision. And this form of engagement is certainly active, right? Like a person is in there actually making the final decision from a model. And it's also often touted as an intervention point in machine learning systems where humans can provide oversight. For example, I think this is kind of like the whole idea behind selective prediction is like if a model isn't super sure about its output, it will give that output to a human to oversee that it makes sure that it gets a good answer. And while human-in-the-loop decision-making may be one way that participation can be included in deployment, on its own, this may not still count as sort of participatory ML. And really, so a participatory project is one which involves stakeholders ideally at all stages of the research project or production of a deployed system. However, the tools of participation can be leveraged at any point throughout the project, and this is often the most feasible way to include participatory methods given limitations. So one could make this human-in-the-loop sort of part of human interaction with ML systems in the pipeline as an intervention point for participatory methods, even though it may not be one kind of as is in and of itself. And this is just one example of, there's a whole lot of papers on human-in-the-loop prediction systems, but that is one excellent paper by Green and Chen. So another place that human participation often occurs in machine learning systems is offering perspectives or reactions after deployment. One example of this is a paper that investigates stakeholder attitudes to a deployed machine learning systems used to select unhoused individuals for housing opportunities. This was a paper by Kuo et al. And while some have critiqued this sort of post hoc engagement with machine learning systems, as we'll discuss later in this presentation, sharing information, such as through data walks, which Luis is going to talk about later, with impacted communities, even after a model has been created, can be a method of participation to empower those affected by algorithmic systems by giving them information, and also by creating a link between researchers or decision makers and those affected, and this can impact future deployment processes, and model creation processes. But as I sort of said earlier, ideally, the way in which human participation would happen in ML is with sort of thinking about the ideation of a machine learning process together. So this would happen more in sort of the problem formulation, maybe even viability assessment phase, where here, in the best case, stakeholders can actually have a say in what the goals of the machine learning system are, how they're designed, and how the machine learning system is built to meet the goals that have been set out. And there have been a few works which develop techniques or engage stakeholders in these early systems of development. Notably, Zhu et al. Have developed a system for integrating stakeholder feedback into the problem formulation stage of algorithmic development specifically. And there have also been some great papers that have engaged with participatory methods throughout the entire design process. They are both from FACT, but I'm sure there are several more. These are by Suresh and Cattell et al. And while these papers have admirably implemented participatory techniques, they're certainly the exception rather than the rule. So there's this sort of gap between how much appetite there is for participatory approaches to machine learning development and how much there actually is on the ground. So some of this may have to do with some obvious stumbling blocks like the cost of human participation and the time, both in production and research settings. But I think it also has to do with the fact that there are sort of many unknowns to using participatory methods in the machine learning development process, and also few documentations of sort of the challenges and limitations that come up with these methods, and that's some of what we're going to touch on today with Sophia and Luisa. So I'm just going to pose a few questions that I would think would be helpful for us all to think about together before we sort of go into all of this. And then Sophia and Luisa will take it from there, sort of talking about some of the actual realities of implementing these techniques. So I think one question that sometimes I don't know the answer to when I'm reading participatory ML papers is, what is the goal of participation in machine learning systems? What's the goal of including participatory methods? Something that I tried to talk about in the intro kind of couple of slides is what constitutes participation in ML systems. I think different people think about this differently. Some people think just being in a data set is participation. Some people think, you have to be co-designing the entire process with the developers of the machine learning system. Where in the development pipeline should participation occur? I think this is something that we've been talking about, but ideally, obviously, it would occur across the entire pipeline, like we sort of mentioned, but realistically, this is probably usually not possible. So given that you might have to choose a few intervention points, what are the best intervention points to choose to sort of maximize the effect of participation once we know what the goal is? And then what are the limitations of participatory methods, and what are the limitations for machine learning in particular? What can it and can't it provide? I think there are, again, myself included, so this is not calling anybody out. There's lots of expectations of participation, pulling a lot of work, doing a lot of legwork for harm reduction in machine learning systems, but there may be a limit to that, and maybe we should think about what that is. And finally, how can we measure whether or not participation has the outcomes that we desire? Is there a way to measure it? Is that helpful to the process of participation? But sometimes it can feel like you don't know if you got what you wanted out of doing a participatory process. Was there actually a mechanism for the participants to make change within the process? And how can you make sure that that's true? And as Luisa will point out further on in the presentation, participation and making an equitable system are not necessarily the same thing. So how can we make participation equitable, and how can we use participation to make an equitable system? So this is what we're going to be thinking about. So for the rest of the tutorial, in addition to introducing the participatory methods from a design and policy perspective, we're going to introduce some case studies of participatory design opportunities and limitations, and hopefully communicate, as I was saying maybe 3 times in the past couple of minutes, that participatory methods are wonderful and offer a lot of opportunities, but may not be a cure-all in and of themselves. So I will pass this on to Sophia.
Thank you, Emily. All right. So I will be presenting on participatory methods and some limitations from a design perspective. So I just want to start by talking about problems, right? In design, problems are usually social problems, which are complex or wicked ones. And that means that they are incomplete. We don't know everything about them. There may be even competing knowledge from different stakeholders, right? Different stakeholders have different views on a certain problem. And they are usually interconnected with other problems that are also very complex. So thinking about wicked problems, we have a situation or problem that we want to research. And we try to complement it by including the perspectives of relevant stakeholders or key actors. And the goal of using participatory methods is to validate ideas, to crowdsource ideas, to build trust, open conversations with community members. And my colleague, Dr. Godinez Puig, will go over some of these methods and how can this be done from an equity perspective. But in design, we mainly are trying to maximize our understanding of wicked problems and identify blind spots by complementing our research with stakeholder perspectives and with perspectives of the people experiencing this situation or problem firsthand. So this doesn't necessarily mean that we are trying to reach one view or consensus, right? It depends on how we structure the collaboration. So a common method we use in design is co-design. And the term actually comes from cooperative design and has a democratic perspective to it. It has its roots and history in trade unions in Scandinavia. And in co-design approaches, all stakeholders like designers, communities at the front of the issue, and others key stakeholders like public agencies, academics, activists, they're all in the same level, right? There is a non-hierarchical collaboration, and that is key. They all have the same input in the definition of the problem, in devising a solution, evaluation of the results, and this requires a lot of trust and cooperation, and therefore co-designing may be more time-consuming, require more coordination, negotiation, and the process may take longer. In participatory design, the designer or researcher is in charge of making sense of the data gathered from the community and other stakeholders' input. And there is, therefore, a hierarchy in the process. And it works as a sort of funnel in decision-making, where opinions, feelings, information about the community and other actors is compiled. And this difference is very, very important, as it determines how much participation there is, and if there is a reinterpretation of the information. Right? So therefore, participatory processes may be faster, but responsibility relies in the designer or researcher making sense of the community's insights as they channel that information into a final design or outcome. So I'll exemplify this participatory process through a real-world example I worked on. In 2019, I collaborated with the Digital Public Innovation Agency in Mexico City for the development of the city's taxi app. And it was a project that involved doing research about the state of affairs in public taxis in the city, doing service design and user experience for the implementation of the app. And we could have approached this project from a very design-focused perspective, since at the end of the day, we were developing a digital platform. But we took very, very seriously the importance of including the lived experiences of those involved in the use of public taxis in the city, and decided to take a participatory approach to the whole development of the app. So for a bit of context, in Mexico City there were in 2019 140,000 taxis, cars, from which an approximate 30,000 were considered pirate taxis or informal taxis that didn't have a medallion, right? And the Ministry of Transportation needed to revamp their database. It was a bit incomplete, so from cars and drivers. And to make it even more complicated, each car had multiple drivers, ranging from 1 to 5 drivers, in order to keep the taxi going 24/7, right? Maximize profits. So a lot of taxis, a lot of people. And then, at that moment, Mexico City was living very high levels of insecurity and violence, especially against women. And in the lapse of 2 weeks, there had been 3 femicides, so the murder of women for identifying as women, and they had been kidnapped on board public taxis. So it became a very pressing issue for the mayor of the city. And mostly for us, it became a pressing issue for women living in the periphery of the city, who used public taxis in one of their legs to go towards the center of the city to work. So we determined there was a need for different levels of participation to understand the problem, and therefore we needed to engage with different groups, multiple groups. And the first group we engaged with was public servants and experts from within the ministries and agencies in the local government. We tried to learn as much from them as we could, and then we asked ourselves, well, who are the most impacted groups by unsafe taxi rides? And we came to the conclusion that the 2 main groups were, of course, everyday people using taxis and taxi drivers, but that we really wanted to focus, because of the context, on women, right, that needed to take those taxi rides from the periphery of the city towards the center. And for taxi drivers, we segmented them into senior and junior taxi drivers. And what I mean by that is that senior taxi drivers were people that had been driving a car for 20, 30 years, and for whom an app just sounded like something they really did not want to kind of adopt in their daily rides. And then for junior drivers, these were more recent generations. They drove public taxis for part of the day, and then perhaps for another part of the day, they would drive a private company app, right? Like Uber, Lyft, Didi, whatever it was. So they felt more comfortable with the idea of adopting an app for their work. So we did workshops and group conversations with them, and we got very interesting insights. We distilled those insights and kind of validated them with our colleagues in the Ministry of Transportation. And so, for example, we learned that most women used a third-party app like WhatsApp to share their location with family members and friends when they were on a taxi. On the other hand, taxi drivers also expressed a lot of fear when working because they were also subjected to a lot of violence when driving around the city. So they also used WhatsApp to communicate with other drivers when something came up. Some of these groups had hundreds of taxi drivers. We also learned there was very little trust on having an emergency button on an app because participants considered that if something happened and they pressed it, no response would be elicited from the authorities, right? So the level of trust was really minimal. And something that I would really like to point out is that these workshops and conversations were a bit contentious. Sometimes we had to make the call on which groups to prioritize, and we decided that women riding taxis would be prioritized, always. But also amongst taxi drivers, the conversations became quite heated at some point, and some taxi groups wanted to dominate the conversation, invalidating the experiences of other taxi drivers. And so I think it's just important to keep in mind that there are always political allegiances and that those are difficult to document and to work through. So we created a set of very low resolution prototypes that were printed out on paper, just mimicking the app and its functionalities, and were shared back with the women we were working with and with taxi drivers in order to see the sort of functionalities that the app required. And once those were determined, we went back to our internal group of public servants and started to see what they already had in place, the existing protocols that could be connected to these functions. And also to see which ones needed to be developed from scratch. And some of those protocols entailed coordinating amongst a diversity of public offices and even neighboring states to Mexico City. So finally, we tested the app on the ground, and we wanted to make sure that the emergency button, mainly, would actually trigger that new Designly protocol that we implemented internally. And this is the map of Mexico City. This is the map of the city. We wanted to serve communities that did not have access to private transportation apps and that lived in non-affluent areas, mainly the periphery of the city, sometimes with low connectivity and usually high levels of peril for women. And so we were trying to really set the harshest conditions for the testing of our app. The green area are the zones of the city where private apps operate, right? So those are kind of the most affluent areas of the city and the airport. And so with these parameters, we selected these areas, the gray dots, and we collaborated with taxi drivers who just drove us around to test the app over and over again and time ourselves to see how long it would take for the protocols to be kind of triggered internally. These are some of the early prototypes we used to test the app, and as you can see, they have some glitches that actually allowed us to go back to the developers and kind of course correct and change some things. And I think it's also worth mentioning that the app, at the end of the day, worked like a mirror, and all of the features that citizens could work with were also available for taxi drivers, because by working with them, it came to light how many of them were actually facing very similar insecurity issues as some of the riders. Finally, the app, we made it so that it could connect to third-party apps like WhatsApp, so that they could very easily just use what they had already been using in order to share their location. So that's the final app, and something that we learned through this process is that even if a diversity of groups, stakeholders, are involved in the process, their political stance is heavy, it weighs, right? And it's important to consider when they're making decisions or acting as a group instead of individuals, right? That can really shift the conversations. But there's also a point where us as action researchers, we also have to be very intentional about who we are willing to prioritize in those key moments. And deliberately leveling the field for some historically marginalized groups in these processes. And I think Luisa will go deeper into that. So I'll just pass it on to her.
Hi, everyone. So we have heard from both of my colleagues around the debates in ML in this field and how designers undertake participatory methodologies. So now I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about how to engage community members to drive equity. So community-engaged methods is how I call it from my field, provides truly a platform for treating community members as valued collaborators, right? As partners, as experts in shaping the future of their own communities. And so adopting an inclusive community engagement really requires taking a super purposeful strategy. And it's really, really important to understand from the outset that community engagement and racial equity are not synonymous, right? A government action guided by racial equity is not necessarily community-based. For instance, let's think of a convening with historically excluded Black business leaders to discuss a new workforce development investment. That may be guided by racial equity, but it may not be a robust community-based engagement if it does not also engage the individuals with the most at stake, like Sophia was saying. That may be the Black youth, families, parents, and residents. In the same way, a community-based process is not necessarily a racially equitable process. For instance, let's think of a participatory budgeting town hall discussing how to retarget certain parts of a city's budget. Even if that town hall reaches, let's say, 70% of residents of that town, it may not be racially equitable if those engagements don't represent the racial and other types of diversities from the city. So I really want to emphasize this point that racial equity is not the same as community engagement. To truly tackle racial equity, we need to rethink our approach to policy. That means thinking outside of the confines of existing structures that have already been perpetuating these inequities. It's really hard to think that you can tackle these inequities using the same system that is causing these inequities and that has been causing these inequities, right? So this requires truly taking a transformational approach that recognizes community members as potential change makers. And this is the real way to advance racial equity by improving processes, by improving systems and outcomes through strategic community engagement. And this is the approach that uses community insight and expertise to shift organizational culture, to recalibrate practices, structures, and systems, and truly effectively address the root causes of racial, ethnic, and other inequities. So I find this illustration pretty interesting, and it really illustrates what I'm trying to say. And this is actually an illustration focused for local governments because local governments have a better chance of achieving equitable outcomes for all residents when they embed the joint processes of racial equity and community-based engagement. And so by including voices of color at the table, local government agencies and their partners are able to build trust in communities and strengthen accountability of public services and improve overall transparency with all types of stakeholders. And so what this means is that every community engaged process that seeks to really tackle racial equity needs to have a joint process. One that looks at racial equity on the one hand and prioritizes dismantling structural racism. It centers the experiences of Black, Indigenous, Latine, Asian American, and Pacific Islander people and other marginalized communities of color, and identify the structural factors that are the root causes of inequities. On the other hand, a community-based process is one that is guided, designed, and co-implemented by residents, such as the ones that Sophia was talking about. It prioritizes community needs and preferences and increases accountability and essentially addresses systemic participation barriers through different types of mechanisms. But I'm sure all of you are wondering, great, that sounds great in theory, everything sounds great, but how do you actually foster a good partnership, right? So when you build, and this is really important because when you build and maintain a good partnership, your work is made not only easier, but also much more transparent and much more representative of the community needs. And working with community members truly ensures that you are asking the right questions, reaching the right people, and conducting your work in an ethical manner, which is also very, very important and crucial. And it's also really important to understand that community partners can provide multiple dimensions of expertise: historical, geographical, technical, lived experience. And these are expertise that maybe research partners and other stakeholders don't have the knowledge on. And there are certain pillars of maintaining a productive partnership with community members and stakeholders. So the first one is to get to know the community, its history, its issues, its people. That means getting a working definition of the community in partnership with the community, learning from past relationships with researchers, policymakers, and practitioners, and how those relationships hurt the trust that the community has for these types of stakeholders, understanding internal power dynamics, such as the ones Sophia was illustrating in her example of the taxi app, and understanding the organizational capacity that these communities have, right? And this is really important so that we as researchers or practitioners don't become extractive of these communities. As I mentioned, it's crucial to foster equity from the onset. That means examining projects through the lenses of racial, ethnic, and gender equity. Compensating community members is crucial because if we want community members to be our partners, we need to treat them as partners and we need to give them a salary for the time, the efforts, and the resources that they provide for us. Addressing power dynamics that exist between different stakeholders, including giving community members a strong voice and exemplifying that through actions. So if community members give us feedback, we need to make sure that we actually take that feedback and it's not just some sort of image that we want to portray, that we are in conversations with communities. And that includes practicing regular check-ins with community members. Committing to transparency is another pillar of a good partnership. Setting clear goals and intentions from the outset, discussing any potential tensions that may exist, working together on budgeting, and again, being very transparent about how budgeting will take place, establishing clear roles and responsibilities from different stakeholders, and really practicing accountability through all parts of the partnership. And finally, it's so crucial to build and maintain trust, because without trust, we as researchers or practitioners can become very extractive of these communities and ruin potential efforts in the future for empowering these communities. So that requires making a plan, showing up, leveraging our resources to assist these community partners beyond the confines of our project in any way that is possible, and to be prepared at all times for any missteps and misunderstandings. Establishing common values and language is also a very important gateway to centering communities of color in decision making and other processes. There are really 5 principles for using community engagement to drive racial equity that we all, as researchers, need to think through as we establish our projects or research. The first one is to empower historically excluded voices. Recognizing people's intersectional identities, right? People of color do not all share identical human experiences. They're not all the same. We need to examine how people's intersectional identities and experiences play a role in shaping opportunity and shaping inequities in order to advance policy change. That includes thinking about different characteristics, their class, disability, gender, sexuality, family structure, immigration status, justice involvement, and really how those intersections affect their lived experience, inequities in the community, and the potential to advance policy solutions. It's also crucial to understand, as I mentioned before, the historical the historical context and challenge pervasive stereotypes that we all have. And this is really a reflective and hard process that we all, as practitioners and researchers, need to do in order to really understand the root causes of these disparities. We also, as I mentioned before, need to compensate expertise and effort. And I cannot emphasize this enough. And I know this creates a lot of limitations in projects because it requires more money. But we cannot, as researchers, insert ourselves in a community, extract from that community, and then not compensate for lived experience, expertise, and efforts and resources. And finally, again, this I talked about a lot before as well, is to develop accountability measures for sustainable systems change. The point is not to do a project and then leave, and we as researchers, we publish in an academic paper and we're all happy about it, right? The point is to truly empower communities and truly empower and give them a voice. We've already said this a couple of times, but it's a very important point. Community engagement can take place at all stages of the research. Ideally, it is included in every step of the pipeline. But sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes we don't have the budget, sometimes we don't have the time, sometimes we just cannot do it or we already started the project. So it's still better to include it at some parts of the project. And there are different tools that we can borrow from community-engaged methods to use it in different stages. And so today I want to talk to you about one such tool. And this tool is called a data walk. Data walks were actually created at Urban Institute, the think tank where I work. And they were inspired by pedagogical techniques that are used in classrooms. And essentially, they are a way to share data and research findings with community members. As I mentioned before, we as researchers often publish in really obscure academic research journals. Sometimes we write in blogs. We present in conferences such as this one. But we never truly share our insights with community stakeholders in a way that is understandable and in a way that empowers the communities that we are nevertheless studying, right? And not engaging with communities may mean a missed opportunity about how the results are perceived. So this is a tool, again, for sharing data and research findings with community stakeholders and getting their perceptions of the conclusions that we as researchers come up with. And it's really an interactive way to establish dialogue around research findings with the community. And a very important mechanism of empowerment. And as I've already mentioned several times, it's truly important that we, through our research, empower the communities that we are studying. So how does it work? During a data walk, program participants, community residents, and service providers jointly review the data that we came up with as researchers in different stations where the data is displayed visually, textually, really to tell a story for participants to interpret and then discuss in small groups with a facilitator. So this allows communities to to get data on their communities, but also to interpret it for us researchers and provide more insight on how that data can be used to empower these communities. And so the goals are to share findings with community members and program participants, to ensure a more robust analysis and understanding of the data, to help inform policy making, and to foster individual and collective action among community members. But it's also very important that we as researchers think more carefully with each project what the specific goal of this data walk will be for this specific project. And these are just a few questions that we can think through as researchers when we organize a data walk. Are we trying to complement our findings? Are we trying to build consensus with the community? Are we more specifically trying to empower community members? How do we plan to present the information and then debrief the groups? And what activities will we organize to achieve these goals? And so these are just important questions to think through as we organize data walks. Finally, I want to talk to you about one example that did a lot of things really well, and that it's a very exciting development in local governments, which is community engagement in local budgeting. But as with, I'm sure, most of our projects, it also faces a lot of limitations, right? And so it's really important to think how community engagement, how we can implement community engagement, but also what limitations we may face when doing so. So actually, because local governments are very close to the daily lives of communities, it is much more feasible for local governments to implement community engaged methods in decision making. We couldn't, the federal government implementing community decision making, that just sounds like a nightmare. So it's really easy for local governments to reimagine how they can include this community engagement in their daily operations. And in fact, a lot of local governments have started to do so, and these are just a few areas in which local governments are already interacting with communities through audits, budgeting, fines and fees, procurement, anyways. But today I really want to focus on one area: local budgets and participatory budgeting. As I'm sure most of you know, budgets in local governments are approved annually by cities and counties, and they establish the priorities and dictate how money is spent for the next year for each local government, right? And some cities, as I mentioned, and counties have started introducing a community-engaged structure within their budgeting practices. And actually, this idea started in Brazil in 1989, and now there are more than 3,000 local governments in the world that are doing participatory budgeting. And today I want to talk about one example that I found really interesting in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. They implemented a joint racially equitable and community-based process for budgeting in 2019. And really, they had 5 goals when they did that. And I took this from their website. The first one was to provide residents with the information and tools that they needed to understand the budget process. Then they wanted to gather public feedback on decisions and alternatives, get residents directly involved via workshops and random representative polling, collaborate with them, including residents in partnerships where they were considered equals in important budgeting decisions, and put the final decision-making power in the hands of those residents. And so in order to achieve those goals, what they did is that they created a budget priority survey, both in English and in Spanish, and then disaggregated the results by race. They discussed budgeting decisions in public meetings, several public meetings. They created what is called a balancing act budget simulator, where residents could play around with the budget and assign different funds to different projects, and then use that data to inform their decision making. They also had community budget workshops where a facilitator explained how budgeting in local governments works, and then took feedback from participants. They authorized additional public meetings to attract a more diverse set of participants after realizing that the first few public meetings did not attract a diverse set of participants. And then they used social media to, again, increase diversity of participants. So because we are talking about participatory methodologies here, it wouldn't make sense for us to give you all the answers. So I actually want the audience to engage a little bit with us, starting from now till the end of this tutorial. And so given these actions that were undertaken in North Carolina, I want to hear from you. In what ways did they incorporate community engaged methods, in your opinion? And I'm not afraid of calling blank calling. How about we ask somebody here in the front? How about you?
They hosted public meetings and created ways to inform people that would be the simulator.
Yeah, they did that. They also, they had the budget simulator. They had essentially all the list that is right there, right? So in what ways did they incorporate a racial, ethnic, gender, equity lens? Yes. Mm-hmm.
It's great to have both an online and in-person opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
And social media, right? Depending on which social media you're hitting, right? Whether it be Facebook, Instagram, you're going to get a certain audience. Um, if we want to get into critiques, I think one of the biggest things about equity is making sure, one of the big talks, right, is about like childcare or offering an ability for folks that can't keep their kids at home or, you know what I mean? So being able to have some type of access to that or food,
Mm-hmm.
events, right? But overall, I really like what they got going on.
Yeah, those are excellent points. I mean, it seems that they really tried to increase diversity of participants. Of course, sometimes it's really hard to do that, and they may have missed a couple of opportunities. Some people cannot attend any public meetings. They work, they have children, they may not be able to go all the way to City Hall. And so those are areas in which maybe future alterations of this program could take a harder look at how they can increase participation. Another thing is perhaps they could have done recruitment in areas that have a tendency to have communities of color, right? To really truly analyze whether participants had a nice, the same type of diversity that the county actually has. And when it comes to counties, it's even harder because wherever the main offices of the county are, may be really far away from those communities of color. I mean, counties can be pretty large, and not everybody has a car, and so there are many other ways that this local government could have increased diversity. So, what limitations do you think they faced or are facing? Yes. Yeah. That's a good question. Did they pay participants, right? Are they being extractive of these communities? These communities are offering resources. I mean, driving there, the gas to go there, if they paid a child care to go there. And we don't know whether they compensated participants for their time. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is a very important a point that you just made. We don't know exactly how they used the feedback, and we also don't know if they used it at all. And without using it, then you're not leading by example and building the trust that is crucial. Yes. Okay, I see. Yeah, so is it more, do you mean, is it more like an image that they're trying to make and perhaps, yeah. That's a good question. Yeah. So there's a yes. Participate. That's an excellent point. What are the power dynamics within the community, and what steps did they take to address those power dynamics? And I think that also leads to this issue of trust as well, right? Like, are you actually exemplifying how to build and foster trust in the community? And are you taking steps to make sure that the voices of those communities that may be less loud are being heard and are able and have venues to be to express their opinions. Anything else that anyone else can think about? Yes. Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Getting to know, that was the first point, the first principle we talked about, right? Getting to know the history, the context, the structures of the community is crucial to trying to study that community. And without doing that, you can become pretty extractive, and you may have it may backfire with your intentions of doing a community engaged process. So I think all of those are excellent points. And again, I don't want to criticize because it's fantastic that they're trying to incorporate community voices, and I think they did take several steps to have a diverse set of participants. But I think this is a fantastic example that shows that we do face as researchers or as practitioners, policymakers, a lot of limitations when we implement community engaged methods. And it's really important to think through these, and it's really important, especially when we are trying to foster and drive racial equity. And so I will pause here because we actually do have more activities coming up. And we wanted to pause as a group to see if whether there are any questions, any comments that anybody here wants to ask. And I will say, I forgot to mention this, that's my bad, but if you can go to the microphone, because otherwise the online participants can't hear us. My bad. Or we can pass, yes, we can pass. I don't know how this works. Oh, over there. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vinitha from the University of Colorado. Thank you for the presentation so far. I had a question about, so there are a lot of researchers at large companies that communities already have a distrust of, or marginalized communities that have been concretely negatively impacted by these large corporations. And so are there concrete ways to rebuild trust with communities for researchers at these corporations so that participatory design can be equitable and remove some of that hierarchy?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. A hard one at that as well. I think applying the principles that I talked about is the way to go. That means creating a plan from the outset with the community, setting goals, roles, responsibilities, accountability measures for every stakeholder involved in the process. And then, most importantly, leading through example, right? Like, if they give us a feedback, then you're going to have to take that feedback into account. As researchers, we don't get to cherry pick, oh, I like what they said. I don't really like what they said, so I'm not going to implement it. But then we do face limitations like the ones Sophia was talking about. Sometimes you do need to prioritize populations. In her case, they had to prioritize women because it wasn't possible to prioritize everyone. And those are the hard decisions that as researchers we need to make. But ideally, those decisions are taken in a partnership with community members. And it's a slow process. It's a process that will take a lot of time and a lot of efforts. And but I am confident that with those when following those principles, it can lead to a much more trust between stakeholders. The problem is that oftentimes all of those steps are missing. And so that's why we as researchers for generations have been extremely extractive of the populations that we study, even when our intentions are good about bringing more data into the world. But we tend to be very extractive as researchers and even more as practitioners.
I don't work with corporations, I usually work with governments, and I found that the way to build trust is institutions overall are made by people, right? And some of the ways that we've been able to work with communities or with taxi drivers is because there's that one public servant that has been working there for 30 years and is on those WhatsApp groups. And when we were like, oh man, we need to collaborate with taxi drivers, she was like, don't worry, let me text them. I've been working with them for a long time. We went out, we did our research, corroborated it with her because she knows, she's inside of it, right? So you need those kind of like representatives or those connections that are the ones that truly, truly maintain the trust and the communication with participants. And that takes time, 30 years as a public servant, right? So, yeah.
Hi, Chris Norval, University of Cambridge. So I'm actually an HCI researcher, so a lot of this is stuff I've been trying to push for and think about for a number of years. And it's great to see these examples, but these examples are all sort of very big, either at the sort of regional level or so on. I'm kind of wondering at the sort of individual researcher level, so maybe you don't have links to hundreds or thousands of taxi drivers. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how individual researchers might overcome some of the challenges about actually getting people interested in the research you're doing and actually finding people who want to participate in research to help make better systems or products or whatever it is that you're doing research on. Thanks.
Where I work at the Burn Center for Social Change, we talk about amplifiers. So it really kind of scoping the different audiences and finding that those people that are really excited about a certain thing and starting to talk to them. And we call them amplifiers because then they become kind of ambassadors of your project. And you might be working at the beginning with 2-3 people, right? But then it starts to grow and grow. And right now, for example, we're doing a lot of education work, and people get really excited about public education, changes in education, things like that. And so just finding those persons that that really want to participate, even if it's just a small pool, and then starting to grow from that.
I mean, I think I would agree with that. And in my experience doing research, I think, sorry, that was a little loud. Working with community partners has been what's been most successful for me. I do a lot of work on with immigrant communities, and truly, I've found that there's 1, 2, or 3 people, surprisingly, in one entire city that is known to every single person and knows every single person, and they because they have built trust with the communities, and if you establish a true partnership with those community members, that is the way to be able to establish more partnerships with other folks in that community. But that requires, again, time. In my research projects, I have started to not do any survey. I don't do any interview without compensating participants. And that means sometimes I can't do the survey. But it's a goal that I set for myself, because without doing that, I just don't think I'm empowering those communities that I'm studying. So what is the point of doing the research at the end? Publishing in an academic journal, sure. And as junior researcher, that's really important, as you all know. But that cannot be the ultimate goal. I think we'll go. Yeah, we have time for 1, 2, and yeah. Oh yes.
Just really quickly in terms of concrete things also. So this wasn't actually for my research, but for some work I was doing, trying to get some predictive policing algorithms taken out of commission in Pittsburgh. And what we did that I thought was really helpful was we just started like looking for interest groups in like racial equity and police brutality, stuff like that. So looking like Facebook, Instagram for groups that were kind of interested in those topics. Like there was a Books to Bars group in Pittsburgh that we then reached out to, and it was kind of just like that, like finding whatever people you can find that are interested in the topic that you're working on, and then maybe working from there. I don't know if that's helpful.
So I think we have two more questions. You and then you? No, I know, but we have more coming. Yes.
Hi.
Change the rules so she can't ask from all the way in the back, so she has to walk here.
Okay.
It's totally fine.
Okay. Thank you so much for your help, though.
Oh, no, I think off.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. I was thinking of more of reflexive questions and positions of power and privilege in your work. And how are you as researchers, from your particular standpoint, really holding yourself accountable, dealing with these different communities? Because we don't want to take on a position of power where we think of ourselves of like God in a nihilistic way. So what are some ways that you're keeping yourselves as check and also engaging with communities, like, as someone has mentioned, trust? What does that look like? Are giving communities voices and platforms to be heard in spaces where they're not. So what does that look like for yourselves? And thank you.
That's a fantastic question. And I think as researchers, we all need to think about our own positionality when we do research, and acknowledge the many structures that have allowed us as researchers to get where we are. And I agree. I think as researchers, you can't go into a community to do your research just so that you actually publish your academic journal. If you truly are interested in that community, you have to empower those voices. And I think the best way to do that is through that reflective process that I talked about, right? This reflective process of what internal biases we may have and have adopted throughout our lives, to acknowledge our positionality from the onset and how that affects our research questions, our conclusions, and then ultimately to truly empower and give a voice, a true voice, to the community members that we engage with. And I don't know if
I would just want to add that it's very hard, right? Because, for example, when I was working with in the taxi app example, I came back to finish my PhD, and I was in another country, in another city, kind of like detached from the project, seeing it afar, and at the same time thinking, oh my God, what did I do? I just helped connect the city cameras to an app so that a car could be found in 3 minutes. Is that going to be used for good, for bad, for like, what did I just do, right? Like, but at the same time I was thinking, but if a woman is on top of a car, I want that car to be, and she's in peril, I want that car to be stopped as soon as possible. So it's also all these nuances on really kind of, that I don't think have a concrete answer, but that they're really, really, it's important to kind of go through them and understand that the things that we're putting out there, right? And to be open and transparent to talk about them, right? I'm very torn about that project, extremely torn. So yeah, I don't know.
I think this kind of builds off of the prior question. Something to me feels inherently different about AI and ML in the sense of how extractive and invasive the products are by nature of how they're built and used. And I definitely understand like compensating for people's time. But I think there's additional considerations when you're engaging communities in decisions about building algorithms using community-generated data that would be run on community-generated data. So I'm just curious, like, if there's if folks have started, if you all, or if you've seen examples of ways to kind of account for the heightened extractive and invasive nature of AI and ML when you're engaging community members in governance decisions.
Yeah, I can start. I think that's a very good point, and I think that's something, as I was going through the literature to put together the beginning of this presentation, I think it's an open question whether machine learning techniques can become participatory at all. And I think that's something that's, interesting to talk about with people who use it in other contexts, because I think one of the things that's so different about ML is the scale at which it's used in different places, and also like the scale of what you can do with the system once you have it. Some work that I've seen, like I think there was the same paper about participation not being a design fix for machine learning by Sloan et al. Was suggesting that it was important to keep things very contextualized to the community that you're building a system for. And I think some of the examples that we've seen of participatory ML that I think have been successful, like the I forget the name of the paper, but it was Best Paper at Fact last year, which I cited in this presentation, about creating a machine learning system to find articles of indigenous femicides. That was a very specific machine learning system for a very specific community that wanted that system, that was engaged in building that system. So I think there's some hope in contextuality and specificity aiding some of that, but I think in terms of whether you can make a participatory system for ad recommendation, I think that's a very different question, and I don't think I know the answer to that, but I would love to discuss it with you guys. So I'm open to whatever thoughts that you have. I hope that addresses your...
Hi, my name is Ro Encarnacion. I'm a graduate student in the HCI lab at University of Pennsylvania, and I'm really interested in the intersection of technology policy and algorithmic justice for historically excluded communities. And I have two questions. One is, what are your ideas around different modes of compensation for communities? Not all the time do people want to be compensated with money. Sometimes they want things that are out of reach for them because money can't provide it for them. And how do you facilitate those different modes of compensation if you can't provide equitable compensation for everyone in that way? And my second question is around the feedback loops with these with community engagement. I find a lot of times in the literature I'm reading, specifically in public health, there's structure to this kind of community engagement where follow-up is one of the most important pieces. And sometimes I've seen where these with community engagement fails is that kind of build this thing and then you run, and then there's no follow-up to see, did it actually work? Does the community still want this? Did something change? So what are your thoughts around that follow-up piece, and how do we make sure that the community stays engaged in a way that's feasible for them, so that there is some kind of feedback loop that makes sure that that community is still included?
I'll take a crack at the second question, then pass to you guys for the first. And I'm sorry to do this to you, Tarek, but I think HRDAG does a really good job of making sure that there's continued capacity in the organizations that they work with. So this is, I apologize, Tarek. I'm just going to steal some things that you said to me, if that's okay. Something that I think that the Human Rights Data Analysis Group has done really well from what I've seen from the people that they've worked with is sort of post hoc establishing if there isn't capacity within the organization or the research group to keep moving on with the project, and you're not sure if there's capacity within the organization that you're working with or the group that you're working with to carry on that project, I think the thing to do is then to allocate some of your resources to bringing the internal capacity of that group up to a place where they can maintain or even change a system that you have created for them. So I think HRDAG does this well. I think in my experience, I've been working with the Internal Revenue Service a lot, and that's something that we've been talking about with them is okay, we're not going to stay working with you forever. make sure that you build up your own internal kind of AI capacity so that you can take care of these systems once we're gone. But yeah, I would say that I think it's a really good point, and I think that follow-up and follow-through is a key component, and I'm only talking from an ML perspective here, but I think one of the key things that you can do there is making sure that if there is an internal capacity with the organization to keep the system that you've made, trying to build it up with them and for them as a way to keep that going. And then your first question about compensation, I'll leave to Sophia.
Sure, I think that's a great question, and I think that goes back to this idea of setting clear rules and working the budget in collaboration with community members, and also the idea that you have to leverage your own resources to help the community beyond the confines of your project, right? And so accountability, talking with community members, asking them what they need and how we can provide that is the way to go here. And if possible, doing all of the above, maybe compensating them with money, but also in other ways as well. But essentially, establishing a good partnership, I think, is the answer. One that truly treats folks as part of the project.
Okay, so thank you for all your questions. That was great discussion. Thank you. So we have a little bit less time to do this than we initially thought, but we're going to make it work. So first, I want to ask, we've maybe heard from some people, but is anyone thinking about using participatory methods in their work, specifically in a way that they would be comfortable talking about with everyone? So would you?
Sure. Should I?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I should use the mic. Okay. Hey everyone, Albert Gahami, City Privacy Officer for the City of San Jose. So one of the big components of what we do is talking with residents about how their data is being processed, how it's being used, what AI systems are behind that, trying to explain to them, you know, in as much as we can, like what's happening under the hood, do they like it, what concerns do they have, how can we put some privacy protections in place. Right now, we are trying to build out basically, like we've done a series of engagement sessions in person and a little bit online on like the suite of technologies that the city is looking to roll out in say the next year or so. And from there, now we are meeting with the departments to get to the impact. And I just want to like echo what you all said. 9 times out of 10 when we're talking with residents, the number one thing they ask or they say is like, I feel like I'm just speaking into a void. Mm-hmm. You know, and that is a very common thing. Even if the answer is, I'm sorry, we can't do anything about this, that is better than the void that is common, right? I'm sure you get that. So one of the things that we're doing right now is that follow-up of creating both an interactive kind of online, how they can see where their feedback is, because it was very place-based, so seeing like this is where you wanted the technology, this is where your concerns were, and also reporting back to them like we've also spoken with the directors of those departments, here is what they had to say and how we're going to move forward with this. So that's where we're with at it. We'll see on how well all of that executes, but so far people have been pretty excited about it.
So I'm here with a group from Duke Institute for Health Innovation, and we're doing a project called Health AI Partnership with 10 health systems in the US to try to create best practices for adopting AI. And during our initial set of interviews that we conducted last year, something we heard from every community member that we spoke to was just there's no visibility into how these products are used. And the reality is most health systems today do use AI in some way, in many ways, in most instances, in clinical care. So the first step that we're trying to do is interviews, focus groups with community members in different geographies that we're working with, understand what type of information is it that community members want about the products that are used, and then kind of create the interface and the structure for health systems to create the documentation, share the documentation with community members. And we're starting from the place of like, let's start with what's already in use, and then potentially how do we try to align priorities, community priorities, with health system priorities for future procurement.
Awesome. Okay, so the reason why we were asking you guys this is that we were hoping that we could maybe all discuss together some of the examples that you guys are working on. So put you guys into groups. I'm hoping this will be helpful for you guys. If you could each, so I think what would be great is if you could each describe in a little bit more detail, like some of the exact systems and processes that you're using to, like, what you're trying to accomplish with your participatory methods and what steps you've taken so far, and like maybe what challenges you're running into, and then maybe we can discuss in a couple of groups in the time that we have left, and then really quickly share out, and hopefully that will be helpful to you guys in your continuing use of these methods for these problems. If not, we have a pre-made method that we can use, but if you think that this would be fun and you're comfortable talking about it and it would be helpful for your work, then we would love to do that. So I'll yay or nay for whether, yeah? Okay, great.
Why don't we divide in two, and then in each individual group, you can go a little further in, since we're pressed.
Do you think these are two big groups?
Yeah,
just like
On these?
over there, and everybody that wants to discuss this group goes over there. So move around, feel free to move around. And for the online folks, you can think about, and for the, excuse me, sorry. My voice is also not ideal for these types of loud levels. Sorry. And for the online folks, please feel free to look at this specific scenario. And so, yeah, everybody move towards the group that you want to participate in, and we will give you... 10 minutes.
So Duke there, San Jose here?
Yes. 7 minutes for discussions, and then we will also ask that you share your conclusions briefly.
So I can give maybe a little more context into what we were doing. So my role basically is like any technology, AI, data initiative, things that we do in the city. If you want to purchase something or you want to do something, it has to go through a review and approval, and that's where I come in.
We have a big group. I think you may have to speak a little louder, ma'am.
Short answer is it depends on the technology. Higher risk stuff, that's where public participation comes a lot more into our policies and how we're using the data. But so right now, the city of San Jose is looking into a few technologies. So you've got things like red light running cameras, which, as the name entails, you run a red light, it reads your license plate, it gets verified by a human being, and then it slaps you with a ticket. Similar concept for speeding cameras, although that one is a little more abstract right now because speeding cameras are illegal in the state of California, which San Jose is in California. This is not San Jose, Costa Rica. In case that was a question. Additionally is gunshot detection. So this is always on microphone, basically, that's listening for, a loud ping, gunshot-like sound. How accurate is it? Great question. That's something that we're trying to test because, frankly, you have a lot of mixed results. And then you have your kind of like bread and butter of just like standard automated license plate readers, which is basically like you have a car, comes by, reads the license plate, and then that helps with after the fact types of investigations for being able to place where, say, a person was for an investigation. So, which one would you like us to focus on? So we can. Is there any one of those that particularly interest folks?
I think the one with the license plates would be the most common in terms of global appeal.
That's a good idea. Let's do that.
Okay.
So the first question that I would have is, how do you define the problem? And this is a question for everybody, not only for you. How would you define the problem? How, like in practice, how would you go about defining the problem?
The problem that participation is supposed to solve, essentially? Or,
Exactly.
I'm guessing questions of surveillance is probably the main thing that people might worry about. when it comes to
Maybe in
that.
a first place, so why do you want to devote a public budget for that and not for something else? I don't know.
Yeah.
What exactly are the benefits that we pursue from this, and how would we measure those?
And would you define the problem as policymakers and practitioners? Yeah, how about one of you takes them? Who wants to be the...
I was trying to help it. You want to moderate, so I apologize.
Oh, no, that's okay. No, I think that's a great idea. Who wants to take the lead on that?
Whose handwriting is still legible?
I can take, but I'd write them
Okay,
on a laptop because
fantastic.
my handwriting is just slow.
So, all right, so would you go to the communities to define the problem, or would you prefer to do it on your own as researchers and then go to the community with a problem? How would you think is most...
So how did the city of San Jose did that? Is that what you're asking?
Or
How would you recommend
how
doing
would you
it?
recommend?
Because you guys haven't done it yet.
We have, but I don't want to spoil the ending here.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
If it can be useful.
So
for discussion,
I'm from the Duke team, but I was interested to just hear about San Jose. But I can talk about like for health system, what we have our request for proposal process. So our community is basically the frontline clinicians, right? The physicians, nurses, and we have an RFA process where they fill out, okay, this is what we request for proposal, RFP, yeah, or application is what RFA stands for. So they fill that out saying that there's a particular strategic theme that the strategic leader has, and they fill out, okay, so for example, the executive leaders of the health systems will say like this year we need to solve issues around like operational inefficiencies, and the clinicians will fill out those problems. So that's one way of doing things. We've looked at other ways of how to solicit problems from the frontline physicians and nurses, as well as like bringing up issues of their challenges in their workplace and things like that. So I'm not sure like if the city has some sort of mechanism to solicit public comments on like the issues.
Yeah. So first off, like I think it is a really interesting question around problem, because like really when we dug into the community and we started talking with them about what the issues are, it's a mixture of like I don't want people driving like a maniac, right? And if someone breaks into my car or breaks into my business or home, I want them to be found. I want this to be figured out. And so in terms of like figuring out that kind of, that problem, we realize, like, at least in our perspective, I think it's really nice to build a sandbox. Like for us, the sandbox was, we're coming to you to talk about technology, which is like really important to set that expectation, right? Because if I'm coming to them, like, I can't put like a speed bump in the road. Okay, that's Department of Transportation, which we've been partnering with to recommend to them, but that's a whole nother conversation. Like, city. But that type of information, like, really is just trying to gather, like, okay, as a resident, what are the problems that we can solve? Great. If we put that into the context of technology that we can work with, now what do you want to see addressed? And so for ALPR, that was like, so that was basically like what we did. And in that conversations, that's where you have the kind of like, okay, ALPR can help with that second thing, like enforcement of, someone breaks into your car, we can help with that sort of investigation aspect. What was the second question?
So it seems that the way you defined the problem was through engaging with community members, right?
Yeah.
So you identified those problems first and foremost with this idea of creating more technology for your city, and then identified the different ways in which you could do it.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is like we're taking as much as we can a privacy first approach, which is something that we found like very useful. A lot of common engagement that you see on this stuff is you have the police department coming in and saying, hey, you know, we're gonna put up this technology, you're gonna want it because of this, that, and the third, right? We took much more of a, hey, there is this technology, we can use it, let's talk about if you want it and what type of protections. And that actually, like just as a side note, we found that to be really useful. Like in a selfish way, our city's job is to make sure that like we are building a collaborative environment between us and our residents. Whether or not the technology is actually useful, the like foundationally is that trust element. And this approach really, sorry.
No, interesting.
Has anyone else heard of this privacy first approach? This is the first time I heard of it. It sounds awesome.
Yeah.
And
Sorry,
yes.
I have a related question.
Yes.
So often when we do this and people come to you with saying, okay, you know, I'm not comfortable with this type of stuff, they either have heard something which they relate to, or they may know something about the technology. But increasingly it's getting to the point where the person has some general concerns about privacy or security, and if you give the answer, no, we're taking good enough care, maybe they're satisfied, without there being a deeper dialogue on what the actual problems and issues are. So how did you get around this, that people may not know enough about the technology to tell you that they have this specific problem?
Yeah, sometimes in this context, people
Yeah.
don't even know what questions to ask,
Yeah.
right?
No, for real.
Yeah.
That's a really good question.
Yeah. So for us, a lot of this, like, you're diving into basically, like, we're getting this information. And you might not know exactly what the information is, but we try to explain that. And then you get into that second layer of the problem to be solved, which is, if this technology is used, what are the problems that it could create that we should be addressing with our privacy protections? Big thing there for San Jose was, how does this information end up with immigration investigations, immigration authorities? For like context, 50% of San Jose residents do not speak English at home, and like 50% of our residents basically are either immigrants themselves or they are children of immigrants, right? So like large immigrant population, large undocumented immigrant population, this is a big concern for them. So that was like the first and foremost thing that came up with a lot of residents. And so that really helped us figure out like, okay, we need to bake into our policies, like not only like we're not sharing with any like federal authorities, but also the people that we work with aren't sharing it with these authorities, right? So that's kind of like, it came out naturally. And I think what really helped with that was just like trying to lay out as clear as possible. For us, like pictures really help. Like as janky as it is, right? Just like a PowerPoint slide of like, hey, this is the technology. It looks like this. It's like the size of your smartphone. And this is what it's capturing. Like here's an actual picture from an automated license plate reader camera. This is what it's seeing. And then we're going to put a box around the license plate and say, and this is what it stores, right? And just like that little process, I think really helped solidify. Yeah. Not in this capacity.
All right, guys, sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but I don't want you guys to miss lunch. So I think hopefully the sharing out that happened within your circles was good. And obviously, feel free to continue the conversation, but just want to alert you that it's over and that there's lunch now. But thank you so much. This was incredible. Really appreciate all your guys' engagement. And feel free to keep in touch. I'm Emily at Stanford/Barnard. And Luisa and Sophia.
Here are our emails if you want to keep in touch. And again, thank you so much for your conversations and sharing also what you do with your work.
Love to hear more about what y'all are doing in the public health space.
Yeah.